part of our three-part series about healing. Last week I talked about the importance of accepting God's healing for us individually. And this weekend we're going to talk about the importance of facilitating healing with one another within our fellowship. If you recall, last week you missed the first part, but I pointed out that so far as accepting healing from God, it's kind of like going to the doctor. And sometimes we don't like going to the doctor. And there's a couple of different reasons for that. And one of them is sometimes, well, with God, with the doctor, sometimes we're scared. We're not looking forward to discomfort. But sometimes we sort of hold back from approaching God for our healing because we feel like we don't deserve it, or we feel like it's hopeless. Expanding outward to the fellowship level, I think that sometimes we have a hard time extending that healing or facilitating that healing with our brothers and sisters because, well, we kind of suspect they don't deserve it and we think maybe they're hopeless. We all feel that way sometimes, I think. But it still falls to us to be the facilitators of that. Just like with last week when I was talking about accepting the healing from God. It's God who does the healing. It's God who is the physician. It is incumbent on us as individuals to do something, then that's all we have to do is just to accept that, right? And within the fellowship, though, it requires, I think, maybe a bit more effort, and I think it's probably harder for most of us, in that we have to be willing to be used by God, to be God's tools from his surgical bag, so to speak, with one another. And sort of expanding on that and looking at these verses that Hannah read for us so eloquently, there's this idea that the church is a body, right? And so expanding from that with the idea of the congregation, the church being a body, there's a need for healing sometimes of that body. That body has to be kept healthy. So far as how we go about dealing with that, there are actually several verses that we're going to look at. Last time I dwelled in the Old Testament quite a bit, most of the New Testament stuff this time. But there's a lot that is said on the subject. And I wanted to start with some more verses that are from the 4th chapter of Ephesians, just to get us rolling here. And it says, "As a prisoner for the Lord, then, I urge you to live a life worthy of the calling you have received. Be completely humble and gentle. Be patient, bearing with one another in love. Make every effort to keep the unity of the Spirit through the bond of peace. There is one body and one Spirit." Further down it says, "So Christ himself gave the apostles, the prophets, the evangelists, the pastors and teachers to equip his people for works of service, so that the body of Christ may be built up until we all reach unity in the faith and the knowledge of the Son of God and become mature, attaining to the whole measure of the fullness of Christ." Again, a little further down, he says, "Speaking the truth in love, we will grow to become in every respect the mature body of him who is the head, that is Christ. From him the whole body, joined and held together by every supporting ligament, grows and builds itself up in love as each part does its work." So here we have that same imagery that is used in the 12th chapter of Romans that we read there, of the imagery of us all being part of a body. And we're not all the same body part. It's not a giant foot. Right? We each have our own gifts and our own skills that we are called to within that body. But there has to be a sense of unity, because a body in Latin is a corpus, right? It is a body. It is a whole, even though it's made up of different parts. So even though there are several interesting points in Ephesians there, what we just read, there are three main points that I want us to kind of first being the church is a body, and the second very closely related one being that there is therefore a need for us to have unity, to function together as a body. And the third thing that I want to point out, that gets mentioned 2 or 3 times in the space of those few scriptures there, is the importance of that body being built up. Being built up. The body, at one point, it mentions growing and being built. So that makes sense. If you have a body, even when you reach a point, hopefully, you won't be like I've been in the last few years where I keep growing in places I shouldn't have. But even if you are an adult, your body still keeps growing because you're replacing different cells, replacing different parts of yourself. And it has to keep, once it stops growing completely, well, either you have attained to this oneness, like it says we have to keep growing until we all reach unity in faith. And I suspect we're not all going to do that this week or next month. So this is an ongoing process if we are a healthy body. We have to keep growing. And it's not just something that happens sort of magically. According to the words of these scriptures, we all have to work toward building that body. The body of the fellowship. Now, we can talk about the church, we know about the congregation, we also can talk about fellowship, and there's some verses we're going to look at about fellowship. But I think one of the questions that arises is, what is the difference, and is there a difference between those things? And there is actually a specific meaning of fellowship beyond the verb of hanging out, or the noun of a bunch of people hanging out. There's more to it than that. And I think that we can look specifically in the book of Acts, right after it had discussed Pentecost. There's just a few verses here, starting in verse 42, talking about what that earliest Christian fellowship, post-resurrection Christian fellowship was like. Verse 42, it says, they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to fellowship, to the breaking of bread and to prayer. Everyone was filled with awe at the many wonders and signs performed by the apostles. All the believers were together and had everything in common. They sold property and possessions to give to anyone who had need. So if we're familiar with the book of Acts, we know that a little bit farther past this, they get divided up and organized in such a way that they're able to facilitate that communal sharing that they have, so they can make sure they have people who are actually charged with making sure no one's going hungry and no one's doing without within their fellowship. Every day they continued to meet together in the temple courts. They broke bread in their homes and ate together with glad and sincere hearts, praising God and enjoying the favor of all the people. And the Lord added to their number daily those who were being saved. So looking at that description, on one hand, they were hanging out. But there was something very specific about their purpose for doing so and the way in which they did so, and this sense of communality that they had. In fact, every once in a while, I'll get a wild hair, as they say, and I'll start delving into things I don't know much about, like Greek or Latin. But the actual Greek word, which is translated as fellowship often, koinonia, comes from a word meaning common. For example, we know that the New Testament was written in Greek, but it wasn't written in classical Greek. It was written in Koine Greek, which was the common Greek. That was sort of a shared language of most of the Mediterranean world at that time. It wasn't necessarily the classy, poetic Greek. It was the Greek of the people, the common people. So the sense of fellowship coming from the same root word as that. Common as in having things in common, as in sharing. So fellowship is very closely related then to the English word community.